In 1950, Guatemala was not really a country, it was a plantation. United Fruit Company owned 42% of all arable land in Guatemala. It controlled the only railroad. It owned the only Atlantic port. It ran the telegraph network. It paid no taxes on its exported bananas. And the Guatemalan government, which received roughly $600,000 annually from United Fruit, while the company earned tens of millions, had no practical ability to challenge any of this. The locals had a name for the company, El Pulpo, the octopus, because its tentacles reached into everything. Then in 1951, a former military officer named Jacobo Arbenz was elected president with 65% of the vote. He was not a communist. He was a Guatemalan nationalist who had read about Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and thought some version of it might work for his country. His platform was straightforward: land reform, redistribute unused land to landless peasants, build a modern economy, end the feudal arrangement that had kept Guatemala poor, while foreign corporations prospered. In 1952, he passed Decree 900. The government would expropriate unused agricultural land above a certain threshold and redistribute it to poor farmers. Landowners would be compensated at the value they themselves had declared for tax purposes. This last detail was the problem. United Fruit had been declaring its land at absurdly low values for decades to minimize its tax burden. When Guatemala offered compensation based on those declared values, $1.185 million for land United Fruit now claimed was worth $15.9 million. The company went to Washington. What happened next was not diplomacy. It was a masterclass in how corporate power purchases government action. United Fruit retained the services of a public relations man named Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud and the inventor of modern propaganda. Bernays organized press tours to Guatemala for American journalists, carefully curated to show Soviet influence where little existed. He planted stories in major newspapers. He arranged for congressmen to visit and return with alarming reports about communist infiltration in America's backyard. The word communist was doing a lot of work in 1952, and United Fruit knew exactly how to use it. But here is where the story gets extraordinary. The two men most responsible for the American response to Guatemala's land reform were brothers. John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State. Allen Dulles was director of the CIA. Both had been senior partners at Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm that represented United Fruit for decades. John Foster Dulles had personally negotiated United Fruit's contracts with the Guatemalan government in the 1930s. The conflict of interest was so complete, it was almost elegant. In August 1953, President Eisenhower approved Operation PB Success, a CIA covert operation to remove Arbenz from power. The budget was $2.7 million. The plan involved training a small exile army in Honduras, a psychological warfare campaign designed to make that army seem larger than it was, and the calculated intimidation of Guatemala's military leadership. CIA planes dropped leaflets over Guatemala City. Radio stations broadcasting fake news of advancing rebel forces were established across the border. The psychological operation was more important than the military one. The goal was not to defeat the Guatemalan army, but to convince its officers that defeat was inevitable. It worked. On June 27, 1954, Jacobo Arbenz addressed the Guatemalan people by radio for the last time. He spoke for 40 minutes. He accused the United Fruit Company directly of orchestrating his removal. He accused the American government of acting as the company's instrument. Then he resigned, walked to the Mexican embassy, and went into exile. The land reform was reversed. United Fruit's expropriated land was returned. The peasants who had received redistributed plots had them taken back. The new military government received $90 million in American aid in the following years. And in Washington, the Dulles brothers filed it as a success. 1 year before Guatemala. A different country. A different resource. The same playbook. In 1951, Iran had a problem that its government considered a solution. For decades, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which would later rename itself BP, had been extracting Iranian oil under an arrangement so lopsided it bordered on parody. Iran received roughly 16% of profits from its own oil. Britain received the rest. Iranian workers lived in company towns with segregated facilities. Iranian auditors were denied access to company books. The oil beneath Iranian soil was making Britain rich while Iranians remained poor. Mohammad Mossadegh was 69 years old, trained in law in Paris and Switzerland, and had spent his entire political career arguing that this arrangement was a form of colonialism that Iran needed to end. In April 1951, the Iranian parliament voted unanimously to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Mossadegh became prime minister the same week. He was named Time magazine's Person of the Year in 1951, a democratic leader standing up for his country's sovereignty. Britain's response was immediate and economic. The Royal Navy blockaded Iranian oil exports. British technicians walked off the job, leaving Iran unable to operate its own refineries. A global boycott of Iranian oil was organized through diplomatic pressure. Britain went to the International Court of Justice, arguing that nationalization was theft. The court ruled in Iran's favor. The boycott continued anyway. By 1952, Iran's oil revenues had collapsed from $400 million to essentially zero. The economy was contracting. Mossadegh was borrowing money to pay government salaries. Britain had hoped economic strangulation would force Iran to reverse nationalization or trigger a domestic coup against Mossadegh. Neither happened. His popular support remained strong. Iranians were suffering, but they understood why. Britain turned to Washington. The Truman administration had initially refused to help. Truman and Secretary of State Dean Acheson were uncomfortable with the idea of overthrowing a democratically elected government to restore a foreign oil company's profits. Mossadegh wasn't a communist. He was a nationalist. There was a difference. Then Eisenhower became president in January 1953, and the CIA had a new director. Allen Dulles, fresh from his Guatemala operation, saw Iran differently. The operation was called Ajax on the American side and Boot on the British side. The budget was approximately $1 million in cash. Some accounts say less. The operational plan was elegant in its cynicism. Iranian newspapers were paid to publish stories portraying Mossadegh as a communist. Mullahs were paid to issue religious condemnations. Members of parliament were bribed to vote against him. Street gangs were hired to create violence and chaos that could be attributed to Mossadegh's supporters. The goal was not military victory, it was manufactured reality. Create the appearance of chaos, communist threat, and collapsing order. Then present the military as the only stabilizing force available. On August 19th, 1953, it came together. CIA-organized mobs moved through Tehran. Military units whose commanders had been contacted by CIA operatives moved against Mossadegh's residence. After hours of fighting, Mossadegh surrendered. He was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. He died in 1967 without ever leaving Iran. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had fled the country days earlier believing the operation had failed, was flown back to Tehran on an American military aircraft. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's assets were returned. Rebranded as a consortium, it now included American oil companies who had been rewarded for their government's assistance, with a 40% share of Iranian oil production. The operation had cost less than $1 million. The oil revenues it protected were worth billions annually. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the CIA officer who ran the operation on the ground in Tehran, later wrote a book about it. He called it a success. 26 years later, the Iranian Revolution swept away everything the coup had built. The hatred it generated didn't disappear. It compounded. September 11th, 1973, Santiago, Chile. At 7 a.m, military units began moving toward the presidential palace. By 9 a.m., Chilean Air Force jets were bombing La Moneda, the presidential palace in the center of the capital, with rockets. By afternoon, President Salvador Allende was dead inside the burning building. Whether he was shot by soldiers or took his own life remains disputed. What is not disputed is what happened next. 17 years of military dictatorship, thousands tortured, 3,000 executed, and the copper mines returned to American corporations within months. To understand why, you have to go back 3 years. In September 1970, Salvador Allende won the Chilean presidential election with 36% of the vote. He was a physician, a socialist, and the first democratically elected Marxist head of government anywhere in the world. He had run for president 4 times. He believed genuinely that socialism could be achieved through democratic means, through votes and legislation rather than revolution and violence. In Washington, this was considered more dangerous than armed revolution. A communist who took power through violence could be portrayed as a thug. A socialist who took power through free and fair elections was something far more threatening, proof that the system worked differently than American foreign policy required it to work. Nixon received the news of Allende's election in the Oval Office. His response was immediate. He turned to CIA Director Richard Helms and said words that Helms later recalled in congressional testimony: "Make the economy scream." The plan had 2 tracks running simultaneously. Track 1 was economic strangulation. American banks were pressured to cut off credit to Chile. The World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank were convinced to freeze loans. ITT Corporation, which owned Chilean telephone networks and stood to lose them to nationalization, contributed $1 million to destabilization efforts and offered the CIA $10 million more. Anaconda Copper and Kennecott, whose Chilean mines Allende planned to nationalize, lobbied Washington relentlessly. The copper mines were the heart of it. Chile's copper represented roughly 80% of its export earnings. American companies had been extracting it for decades under arrangements that left Chile with a fraction of the actual value. Allende nationalized the mines in July 1971. The Chilean parliament voted unanimously, including the opposition, in favor of nationalization. Washington escalated. Track 2 was military. The CIA identified Chilean military officers who might support a coup and began cultivating relationships. One early attempt failed. General René Schneider, the Chilean army commander who refused to involve the military in politics, was kidnapped and killed by CIA-backed plotters in October 1970. The operation backfired, temporarily strengthening Allende's position, but the economic pressure was working. By 1972, inflation was running at 140%. Truck owners, many organized and funded by CIA-connected organizations, went on strike, paralyzing the country's supply chains. Supermarket shelves emptied. Middle-class Chileans who had initially supported Allende grew frightened and angry. The chaos was partly real and partly manufactured, but the distinction didn't matter to families who couldn't find cooking oil. On the morning of September 11th, General Augusto Pinochet moved. The Air Force bombed the palace. The army surrounded it. At approximately 2 p.m., with the building on fire and his guards killed or captured, Salvador Allende died. The CIA's direct role in the coup itself remains partially classified. What is documented through declassified CIA cables, congressional investigations, and Nixon's own recorded conversations is that the United States spent approximately $8 million destabilizing Chile between 1970 and 1973, that American officials knew the coup was coming, and that the new Pinochet government was recognized by Washington within hours. The copper mines were denationalized. American corporations recovered their assets. Chile received American aid and military support throughout 17 years of documented torture and murder. Henry Kissinger, when asked about the contradiction between American democracy promotion and Chilean policy, was characteristically direct. He said, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people." The irresponsibility he was referring to was a free election, 3 countries, 3 democratically elected governments, 3 CIA operations. Guatemala cost $2.7 million. Iran cost $1 million. Chile cost $8 million. The oil and copper and banana revenues they protected were worth billions. The pattern was not a coincidence. It was a business model.